Welcome to episode 136 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about Queen's album from 1980, The Game. And this is the first Canadian pressing. You can tell the early pressings because they actually have the shiny foil finish. And this is an album, it's an interesting record because it's arguably their last great record. This is certainly the last record where they rock pretty much consistently all the way through, full of great rock songs, full of great hooks. So in the mid to late 1970s, Queen were riding high on this blend of rock, pop, Broadway, and even opera at times. They stepped into a more experimental space in 1978 with the release of Jazz. They went back to their former producer, Roy Thomas Baker, and this album, while quite well thought of these days, was not that well received at the time. It's not surprising, therefore, that they moved back in a more commercial direction with The Game in 1980. But of course, whatever their fortunes in the studio, they were an absolutely massive live act in the late 1970s. Zeppelin and The Who, who were maybe their only real competitors in terms of being big, hard-rocking arena rock bands at the time, were both going through their own crises. They both had their own internal tragedies, and each was having a bit of a fallow period and somewhat retreating from the public eye. Not the case for Queen. In 1978-79, they were probably the biggest live act in the world. The Jazz tour was absolutely huge. And in the middle of 1979, after the Japanese leg of that massive tour had ended, they had a bit of time off in Germany, in Munich. This was quite fortuitous because Munich, of course, is the location of Musicland Studios. Musicland, of course, was created in 1969 by Giorgio Moroder, who is known in history as a major contributor to the whole disco sound. One of the people in Giorgio Moroder's orbit in Munich was a producer called Reinhold Mack, who goes by his surname Mack. Mack was already known in the 1970s for his work with Deep Purple in the David Coverdale era, for his work with ELO, and he's in LA in the spring of 1979 having lunch with Giorgio, and Giorgio says, hey, I think that Queen are in Munich, and I think they might be looking to come to the studio and they might want to work with you. Mack says, okay, that sounds like a great tip, so he buys a plane ticket and he flies off to Munich. After he arrives in Munich, he goes to the studios and he first meets with Freddie Mercury. And Freddie says, what are you doing here? And Max says, well, I was having lunch with Giorgio in LA and he said that you guys wanted to work with me. And Freddie says, well, that would be a great idea, but we only have a couple of weeks left in our break. We've just finished this long tour. We're heading back to the UK. So I don't think it's going to happen. So because it was a nice day, they left the studio, and it being Munich, they went out to a large beer garden and had a few beers. And with those beers under their bellies, they decided to go back to the studio because Freddie had a song he'd been working on. He'd actually written it in his hotel in Munich in the bath. And that song, of course, is Crazy Little Thing Called Love. Freddie says to Mack, well, I can't really play guitar very well, but let me just strum it out and I'll play you the melody and sing it to you and see what you think. And Mack says, okay, and he actually has the tape running. Well, of course, Freddie lays down an absolutely amazing track. So in at that point come Roger Taylor and John Deacon, the drummer and the bassist, respectively, of Queen. And in a matter of hours, either 6 hours or half an hour, depending who's telling the story, the basic track is built. Brian May then comes on the scene and listens to the song and agrees it's great, and Mack persuades him to lay down a solo. So out of nothing, out of a moment where they weren't going to record anything and they ended up just going to have beers, Mack and Freddie and then the rest of the band have created the song, which gets released as a single and goes to #1. Mind you, they still didn't have an album in mind, and they were still working on this new relationship with this new producer. And he had a habit of challenging their established ways, and Queen were a very democratic band, a very technically focused band, a very proud band, because of course they had said for years they would never use synthesizers. If they couldn't get a track right, if they couldn't get the backing part right, they wouldn't just cut and paste and create a pastiche of their different contributions. They would sing it again and again and again until they nailed it. And that was the case with all the other work that they did when they built up a track. Mack did things differently. He was much more willing to cut and splice and copy and reuse different pieces. And Queen didn't like this, but as he said, I worked faster than they discussed. So they would get into a discussion around a technical piece of what to do with a particular track. He would just get the track ready and play it back to them. And the quality of what he played back was normally enough for them to go along with what he was trying to persuade them to do. They continued to tour, but they came back for 2 more sessions, and the album was ready for release in the summer of 1980. It was a massive success, and it went to #1 in the US, the UK, Canada, and lots of other places. And both Mack and the band, as co-producers, were nominated for a Grammy for Producer of the Year. Side 1 starts with Play the Game, which is a tremendous track and a very complex and interesting track, but The first thing that you would have noticed as a veteran Queen listener was that it started with the sound of a synthesizer. But it was hard to argue with the results. It's a brilliant multi-part composition, atmospheric, spacey sounds of the synth, then giving way to this beautiful clean solo by Brian. Freddie's vocal performance is incredible and a remarkable start to the record. Then we come to Dragon Attack, which was one of my very favorite Queen songs. It might actually be my favorite Queen song. It's a Brian May song. It was only ever released as a B-side on a single off this record. It's also the first real star turn for John Deacon, and this is anybody's album. This is really John Deacon's album. He had, amongst other things, been hanging out with Chic, that seminal and super influential disco band, in the summer of 1978, and he was there when they cut their famous track Good Times off their third album, Risque, and he brought that kind of bass forward thinking into so much of what actually happens in the album. Now we come to the most famous song on the record, one of the most famous songs that Queen ever did, and a controversial song for Queen, because of course it's not a rock song, it's a flat-out disco song, and that of course is Another One Bites the Dust. I mentioned that John Deacon had spent some time with Chic the previous year, listening to Bernard Edwards play the bass on that great song Good Times, and you can hear that staccato three-note pulse which Edwards uses in the Chic song also on Another One Bites the Dust. The rest of the bass line isn't mimicked in any way, but the influence is super clear. Above and beyond the bass and composing the song, this really is Deacon's song all over, because he also plays piano, he plays rhythm guitar, he plays a little bit of lead guitar, and he plays some percussion on this song as well. Taylor himself does play drums. What they did, he and Mac, was to actually stuff his drums full of padding to give a kind of a dull thudding sound, which is distinct from the much more resonant sound which Taylor normally had from his drums. Taylor hated this. He was not keen on the song at all. It was, as I say, contentious until Freddie comes in the scene. And as soon as Deacon lays down the bass line, Freddie is just beside himself with how good a song this is, throws himself into a vocal performance which is one of his best ever, and when Taylor voices concerns, says, "Don't worry, darling, I believe in the song, I've got it, leave it with me." The second last song on side one is Need Your Loving Tonight, another successful single. This to me is about as pure an example of a Beatles song, which occurs in a Queen record, as I can imagine. It has not just the verses and the whole kind of cadence of the song, which are rather Beatlesy, but I think the bridge is an absolutely brilliant version of a Lennon and McCartney middle eight. The final track, of course, on side one is Crazy Little Thing Called Love, which I've already discussed, but which was a massive #1 hit. If side one is basically pure gold, side two kind of has hits and misses. I won't say they're filler, they're high quality, but they're still album tracks as opposed to potential singles. Part of that has to do with the fact that Roger Taylor has a couple songs on side two. I know opinion divides amongst Queen fans regarding the quality of Taylor's contributions. I think if Queen as a band had to rely on Roger's songwriting alone, I don't think they'd be the kind of band and have enjoyed the kind of success which would make me want to review their records 40 years after the fact. But again, they're not terrible, just not particularly memorable. And I think that's true of the first song, Rocket, Prime Jive. Freddie and Roger share the vocals here. Lots of energy in this song. Melodically, just okay. Much better song follows, which is a Freddie song, Don't Try Suicide. An unusual number. It's kind of a witty and ironic look at suicide, which is difficult to pull off. That's followed by Sail Away, Sweet Sister, which is a Brian May song. Brian takes the lead vocal, Freddie sings the bridge. It's okay. I find the song, though, a little bit earnest, basically. The next song is Coming Soon, which is another Roger Taylor song, and it's another kind of C+B rocker. Lots of energy, again, shared vocals. There is, however, one more highlight in this album, which is the very last song, Save Me. This did quite well as a single, largely, I think, because of a really epic vocal performance by Freddie. And there's this one line, the kind of the money line at the end of the chorus, I'm naked and I'm far from home, which has so much emotional impact and is a wonderful way to wind up the record. So The Game is maybe not an album which has the sweeping artistic ambition of A Night at the Opera, nor necessarily does it deliver in the same way. But it's a thoroughly pleasing album of great Queen songs, and even the weakest points are not really that weak. For some people, kind of the disco sucks crowd, this album is the beginning of the end, because here you've got disco creeping in and a different kind of production flavor and fare. But for me, this record is the second best album they ever did. 2 #1 singles on this and 3 other singles which did really well, which is a mammoth record by anybody's standard. After this, they would embrace pop a lot more thoroughly, not always successfully, in fact, rarely successfully, and never really put out another record which rocked. And then sadly, of course, by the mid-'80s, Freddie's disease starts to take hold, and whatever creative turns they might have taken subsequent to that, we're never going to know. So this is their last great high water mark, and for me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.